We are very fortunate to have Dr. Melissa Phillips as the moderator of today's event. Dr. Phillips is a lecturer in Humanitarian Development Studies in the School of Social Sciences at Western Sydney University. Her research interests include migration, mobility, displacement and refugee settlement. She has previously worked for the United Nations and NGOs in South Sudan, Kenya, Libya, Ethiopia and the Middle East. Melissa is a board member for the International Detention Coalition and leads the Migration and Diaspora theme for Western's Humanitarian and Development Research Initiative. Thank you, Dr. Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for joining in person. And I want to acknowledge the people who've joined online for this, what is going to be an incredible hour of reflecting on issues around peace and democracy on the International Day of Peace. I wanted to, well, as I said, I look forward to facilitating this conversation on an important topic, which is being held as part of the library's Thought Leadership series, which celebrates Western Sydney University's #1 ranking 2 years in a row in the Times Higher Education Impact ranking. They're the only global performance measure that assesses universities against the UN SDGs. First, I'd like to ask you to join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Claire Pollock, the Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost and Acting Vice-Chancellor. Thank you very much, Professor Pollock.
Thank you, Melissa. Before introducing our guests, it would be remiss of me not to actually acknowledge again, as Melissa was saying, that today is the International Day of Peace. And this year's theme for the International Day of Peace is Actions for Peace. I've also been reminded that the UN General Assembly have been meeting in the last couple of days, and the last 2 days, I believe, has been focused on considering the Sustainability Development Goals. As Melissa mentioned, we're very proud of the work we do in terms of progress around the SDGs. This is an important point in time for the SDGs. This is in fact the midpoint of the implementation of the United Nations SDGs, which aim, of course, for a more peaceful, just and inclusive society, free from violence and fear. Very proud of the work that we do in that space. And today's thought leadership piece, I think also helps progress our understanding of work towards peace and our understanding of the work that perhaps we need to embed more fully and understand more deeply as we work towards a more peaceful society. As said, it's my great pleasure to introduce the speakers for today's event. Of course, our leading speaker is Dr. Izabela Pereira Watts, the author of Peace or Democracy, Dilemmas for Peacebuilding, the book on which today's discussion is based. Dr. Watts is a former UN peacekeeper and also a lecturer at Western Sydney University. She has over 15 years' experience in development cooperation projects across Asia, Latin America, Africa and Europe with major international organisations such as the United Nations and the Organisation of American States, as well as private and public sectors, the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Peruvian Embassy. Her passion and energy have been recognised through multiple awards, including the top 99 under 33 most influential international leaders by Global Affairs magazine's Diplomat Courier, and the Juncker Prize for Humanitarianism and Education. Dr. Pereira Watts is proud to present her new book, Peace or Democracy, Dilemmas for Peacebuilding After Civil Wars, published by Routledge UK, with a foreword written by Nobel Peace Laureate Jose Ramos-Horta and endorsed by former members of the Parliament of Kosovo and Rwanda and United Nations high officials. Dr. Pereira Watts is joined by two guests today. Leanne Smith is the Chief Executive Officer for the Australian Human Rights Commission. She's a human rights advocate and international lawyer, and previously was also the director of the Whitlam Institute, which is housed here at Western Sydney University. Leanne has worked in the international NGO sector of the Australian judicial system for regional human rights organisations and as an Australian diplomat for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She's worked for the United Nations for over a decade, including as Chief of Policy and Best Practices for UN Peacekeeping. She also served in the field, from Afghanistan to the Balkans, Africa and Southeast Asia. We're very fortunate to have her joining us today. Also joining us today is Dr. Simon Longstaff AO, who's Executive Director of the Ethics Centre. He began his working life on Groot Uitland in the Northern Territory of Australia and has kinship ties to the Anindiyakwa people. My apologies, I couldn't quite get that. He studied law in Sydney and he taught in Tasmania. He pursued postgraduate studies as a member of Magdalen College, Cambridge, and in 1991 commenced his work as the first Executive Director of the Ethics Centre. In 2013, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to the community through the promotion of ethical standards in governance and business, to improving corporate responsibility and to philosophy. He's an adjunct professor of the Australian Graduate School of Management at UNSW, a fellow of CPA Australia, and of the Royal Society of New South Wales and the Australian Risk Policy Institute. He's inspired by people's openness and generosity and seeks to understand ethical questions from a perspective of shared humanity. Please join me in welcoming our three panellists today.
Thank you so much, Professor Pollock, for the introduction and drawing attention to issues of peace that are in our own country that we will have an opportunity to attend to as a nation in just a few weeks. And as Izabela's book highlights, peace in many other countries is something that we agonise over and think about. And this is also an opportunity to think about peace in our own country and ways in which we can offer justice, listening and a voice to Indigenous Australians. So I wanted to also thank the library for bringing this event together and for also just thanking you all for coming in. We've got a wonderful mix in the room for those of you online of students, and it's great to have a conversation with young people who are studying humanitarian and development studies and other subjects. So thank you so much for joining. It is an event also to celebrate a wonderful text that's been written by Izabela and published. Izabela, I will now play this video.
Why do countries torn by civil war rarely emerge as robust democracies with sustainable peace? Why? On the one hand, everyone wants peace. Importantly, the democratic peace theory that observes an absence of war between democracies seems to be indeed, and arguably, as close as anything we have as an empirical law in international relations. On the other hand, since the end of the Cold War, the New World Order has included the spread of democracies and an explosion of conflict, from genocide in Rwanda and Darfur to civil wars in the DRC, Cambodia and Timor-Leste. But if democracy is good for peace, why are we not living in conflict-free times? Why? Despite an unprecedented number of UN intervention operations to enforce peace and build democracy, rarely can war-torn countries make transition to both peace and democracy. Either they are trapped in an endless cycle of conflict, or they achieve stability only through a non-democratic rule. We have recently reached an unprecedented humanitarian crisis: 100 million refugees. The past 2 decades have shown an exponential increase in the number of civil conflict and authoritarian regimes, as well as a decrease in the levels of democracy and of peace and security in consolidated democracies. Only 20% of the world's population lives in free countries. That means that 8 in 10 people live in not free or partially free states, according to the Freedom House. Put into perspective, this book concerns at least 1.5 billion people who live in countries of fragility and conflict. The political transition to civil democratic peace is often conflict-ridden. So contrary to the common belief that peace and democracy go hand in hand after civil war, this book explores how they are at crossroads in constant tension. There is twice the number of autocracies than democracies in the world right now, while authoritarian regimes have also become even more violent. Beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, an epidemic of coup seems to have taken the stage in the international arena. In 2021, the number of coup attempts and violent demonstrations matched the highest point in the 21st century, accelerating cycles of violence in countries wrecked by conflict, such as Sudan or Burkina Faso. The scope of this book is all about the paradoxes between civil wars, democracy, peacekeeping, and the United Nations. It might be that although to build peaceful and democratic states seems to be an ideal formula to end civil wars, reality might show that in fragile states, not all good things come together, and certainly not at the same time. In a globalized world, the fight for democracy cliché or shifting bullets for ballots can also be lethal and a tool to legitimize abuse of power or instigate potentially violent communities. Moreover, the transitional phase is inherently tumultuous. It can exacerbate social tensions, challenge elite power, and undermine the prospects of stability in the politically fragile conditions that are typically found in countries emerging from civil wars.
So first, what are the main dilemmas in seeking to mutually achieve peace, democracy, and a functional state? Contrary to the common belief that peace and democracy go hand in hand after civil war, it is arguable that they are in fact at crossroads in constant tension. The literature on peacekeeping, democracy building, and state building already identify few dilemmas. This book advances by identifying additional dilemmas and proposing a dynamic platform of 14 dilemmas in democratic peace building with respective trade-offs. This is the Philosophical, Actors, and Tactical PAT platform. Based on an analysis of more than 40 countries between 1989 and 2022 and more than 60 UN peace operations, the book critically analyzed 12 commonly issues that needs to be addressed in any situations of that kind: elections and political parties, the constitution, check and balances, power sharing, transitional justice, human rights, amnesty, truth commissions, and war crime tribunals, DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, as well as media reform and civil society.
Solving one of these dilemmas leads to others that shapes a complex apparatus of restoring peace and installing a new democratic political regime. Second, what role do United Nations operations play in bringing simultaneously peace and democracy to post-civil war countries? So by comparing civil war cases with United Nations intervention and without it, it's possible to explain why UN missions sometimes bring some peace, but rarely a functional democracy to civil war-torn countries, or vice versa. It is actually more accurate to claim that often a moderate level of each is achieved. When a civil war ends, what do we put in place? How can we bring political stability or democratization out of chaos? We know that in a perfect world, we want to build democracy and peace. The issue is that looking closer into civil conflict, inevitably, those two forces will meet at crossroads. Thus, difficult choices must be made between peace and not so democratically, or democratically, but a resurge into violence like South Sudan. The transition period is where those dilemmas reside the most and therefore is the most parallel. This is not about white doves and rainbows as the idealistic view of peace. This is not just about humanitarian aid or financial assistance for others' problems. This book does not pretend to have discovered a miracle alchemy. Nonetheless, by pulling together the strands of various theories, practices, and case analysis, the book discloses interesting insights into the contradictions of building peace, democracy, and a strong state as simultaneous goals in the aftermath of civil war. Although not a cure for all, the book seeks to provide an answer to these questions. Neither democracy nor peace building is panacea. Importantly, peace building and post-war democratization are simultaneous tasks dependent on the direct influence of the elites. This understanding helps to shed light on why peace-building missions often bring some peace, but rarely democracy to war-torn countries. After civil war, law enforcement institutions must be developed concurrently, such as the creation of an effective police force and a criminal justice system. Similarly, political institutions, a non-political judiciary, and electoral commission must also be established. Without these institutions, democracy will fail, as the promise to obtain security for citizens or political rights for the warring factions will be only fallacies. From war to peace, how to bring political stability and democratization is not an obvious exercise. Undoubtedly, it requires an alignment of interest and factors to avoid falling into the trap of electoral authoritarian regimes without conflict resolution. The transition from the rule of the gun to the rule of law is not an obvious exercise, but is nevertheless critical. And this is precisely the essential aim of this book, to assist with an integrated approach when peace and democracy are at crossroads. Hopefully, it can also contribute to making peacekeeping a more robust, more effective, and comparatively more cost-efficient conflict resolution tool for current conflict and avoiding failed transition and fragile states.
So absolutely, we have, as Izabela's pointed out in the book and in the video, a huge investment of energy, money, hope for transition after conflict. And yet we are experiencing greater instability, as you mentioned in the video, Izabela, through particularly as evidenced by the huge number of refugees and displaced people in our world today. So I wanted to start by asking our speakers, our panellists, about sort of the health of democracy at the moment. Just to start with a small question. The Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has talked about an epidemic of coups, an epidemic of instability when we think about what's happened recently in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Gabon. So is the Secretary General correct in saying that, you know, democracy is on the way out, that with these coups? Now, I don't know who's going to... I'm going to pass a microphone to each of our panellists, so I don't need to... Leanne, do you feel like you are okay to start with that question?
I'll give it a go. I'll take a... Is that working?
Yeah.
I'll take a shot in the dark. I mean, I think I'm thinking of murdering a Winston Churchill quote, but democracy may still be the least worst option we have. And I think some of the crisis we're seeing in democracies, we have to think not about the crisis or the conflict in the moment, but the heritage of each of these nation states, where they come from, what kind of crisis they've been through, colonisation, of course, all of the things that contribute to what a nation state is like at a point in time. But also I would say that democracy only works when it delivers good governance and when it delivers peace dividends. And when democracies, like any other kind of governance structure, stop delivering those things for its citizens, it loses value. And so other options become much more likely, I think.
Thank you, Leanne. Simon, did you have some reflections on that very big question? You can keep it because I can use it.
I was going to quote not Churchill but Mark Twain, rumours of my death are much exaggerated. Look, democracy is often chosen and is seen to be attractive for all the wrong reasons. People see visions of what a democratic state could be exemplified in places like the United States, for example, or Britain, and they see prosperity and relative stability, although it's a bit rough from time to time. And they don't necessarily choose it because of its intrinsic characteristics. Rather, they think it will deliver all of these things. So it has a very high capacity to disappoint people. And when it disappoints people and doesn't deliver what was initially promised, then they are easily detached from their commitment to it and it starts to fragment. What democracy typically offers is not necessarily peace because there are other systems which can generate peace. I mean, you just look at the period in the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Empire where Augustus brings peace after civil wars by instituting effectively a monarchy, which was a poisonous word for the Italians of the day. But he presents it as if he is reinforcing the conditions of the old republic with its sensibility and division of power. But he brings peace. And for a long period until the next cycle of civil wars, and then when Vespasian comes, there's another period of peace. You get what people are really yearning for without it necessarily being democratic in character. So if you're not going to buy democracy because it necessarily delivers the goods that you believe in, and you're not buying it because it necessarily is the only way to secure peace, why might you choose it? And ultimately people choose democracy because they believe in something to do with its innate legitimacy. But instead of being like a political system where legitimacy is derived from God in a theocracy or the wealthy in a plutocracy or the virtuous in an aristocracy, there's something about the legitimacy of authority lying in the persons of the governed, which is worth having. But that is an abstract concept at the end of conflict. And people might say, actually, I don't care about that so much as just give me the peace.
Yes, that resonates so much. I'm thinking about South Sudan as you speak, where after decades of conflict, people were less interested in democratic transition and more interested in seeing, as Leanne talked about, the dividends of peace. And so there's also clearly a time for democracy that may or may not come immediately after conflict. Izabela, I was wondering if you could talk about those dividends of peace and the link to good governance.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I think I can read the bubble of thoughts of Miriam by listening to those wonderful, thank you so much for being next to me. Thank you so much. I would like to actually try to answer if democracy is dying. Well, statistics shows already that not only we have for the last 16 years a decrease on the levels of democracy. So it's not only a yes or no questions, are you democratic or not? We all have levels. No wonder why we're having the referendum here and etc. So it's a process and evolves and etc. But if there are double the amount of countries that lives in non-democracies than in democracies. So those are statistics to think about it. But advancing, we also always have to progress on the question, if democracy is dying, will it survive? That could be another question. Will it survive? With all those coups, attempt of coups, or an epidemic, it sounds like we discussed this in class. Epidemic is a disease, it's contagious. Second, if it does not survive, what would be in place? Because as far as we know, it's still the best system despite all its problems. So if it does not survive, what system would then surge?
Thank you, Izabela. I might stay with you to then continue that conversation around whether democracy is a sort of precursor for peace. if you could talk a little bit about that linkage between democracy and peace.
Simon here presented a view of negative peace, right, my dear students? Yes, clearly, and thank you so much. Leanne talked about governance, which is positive peace, a concept that we also work in class so many times. If democracy creates peace, or if it's peace that creates democracy? I can. Which one? It's like the egg and the chicken, yes? This kind of, maybe they go hand in hand?
I think that dichotomy is leaving out some of the things that were in your video. So for me, as a human rights lawyer working in a peacekeeping context, straight away missing from peace and democracy is justice for me. And whether that's transitional justice, I think we, as the UN, coming into other people's countries, and I want to acknowledge there may be people in the room here who have either experienced conflict or had family members experience conflict. We go into other people's countries, and I think the international community, the Security Council, has a time frame for action. Certain governments have a budget for how much they're going to throw at this problem. And we come in with an agenda, and we very, very rarely understand the depth of pain, the depth of suffering, the depth of mistrust, and how long it takes to deal with those things before you can just create an infrastructure, the Bonn Agreement in Afghanistan, and say, tick, 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 we've established rule of law, we've got a constitution. We underestimate the time it takes to get to peace, and democracy might be a tool on the way to that.
So if you look at, and I think it's very important to make that distinction between peace as an absence of conflict, a very narrow, thin version of it, and something more substantive, which includes justice. One of the biggest problems I think that you find when people are trying to establish democracy is that various segments of a community will not recognise the intrinsic dignity of other persons and therefore their right to be participants in this. So they'll look at a person because of their religious views, perhaps ethnicity, cultural differences, and they say, oh, well, they're not fully entitled as I am to have a say in this future decision-making. And of course, when dominant groups, and they can be dominant numerically, economically and otherwise, then hijack democracy for their own purposes without according recognition to the intrinsic dignity of others, then it becomes a poisonous kind of environment which is bound to fail because it doesn't have that capacity to reconcile not just grievances, but to reconcile aspirations for something better. And so I do think it's a very fragile thing. It requires a lot more. It requires all of the institutional building blocks, but it requires that kind of fundamental ethical move to see in others, even after conflict and even after sometimes very brutal engagements, that notion of intrinsic dignity that says your voice has a right to be heard within the confines of our environment, our decision-making and so forth.
Thank you, Simon. And, as you're both speaking, the democratic process that we're going through in Australia is raising all these questions for us.
Very much so.
And so, as you said, this in a country where there may have been decades of conflict, long-held hatreds. And Leanne, I just wanted to pick up on a comment you made about the United Nations system, the structures and the systems that support peacekeeping and peace building, that there's a tension between timeframes and timelines and outputs and outcomes that may not align with where a country's at. So how do you reconcile that tension in order to get a much thicker notion of democracy, as Simon's sort of alluding to? Is it that the United Nations system is not the right institution for peacekeeping and peace building, or is it that somehow this model needs to be shook up a bit?
I think it's I don't think there is a solution. I don't think there's an answer to how you bring it all together. But in my experience of working in peacekeeping missions, there are things that I've learned along the way. And they include things like the motivation of the international community. And I don't mean just the UN, I mean all member states of the UN. The motivation for intervention is the first thing. If the motivation is nation building, then you might be in a good place to start with. If the motivation is geopolitical or something else, and this was the case in Afghanistan, in my belief, the international community, or at least parts of it, intervened for reasons that weren't about Afghans or about Afghanistan. And that was a fundamental flaw from the very beginning. So everything, all the money that was spent, everything that was built layer upon layer, the foundations were wrong. And so if that's the starting point, you're in trouble. I don't think the UN's the only organisation that can get into this space, and I think the UN itself has recognised that often regional responses are more valuable than multilateral ones. But neighbours can be a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to a civil war as well. So it depends what role they play.
Izabela, did you want to add anything?
It's just, I'm so amazed for you to hear that from both of them, all the things that we've been discussing in class. What an opportunity. Thank you so much.
We've really moved a bit to that next question about the responsible entities around peace building and democracy and development. And yet Simon, you're also sort of talking about where everybody's involved, everybody's engaged. Could you say a little bit more about that? Sort of the need for it to sort of be inherent in everybody for this to sort of be a project that is successful. How do you do that? How can that happen?
Education is one of the most important things. When you have an uneducated or poorly educated community, it's very easy to have stereotypes and biases about others reinforced. You can prey on ignorance and fear very easily, and some people are quite masterful in exploiting that for their own political ends. They'll dress it up in religion or culture or ethnicity, and they will drive wedges wherever they can. An educated person is much less likely to be susceptible to that. Not completely immune, but less so. And what I was trying to get at is that you can have very severe conflict between people, and it can be amongst groups of people who respect the other side, not in terms of their capacity to wage war or bring about kinetic or material effects, but they say, I know you are like me, you're on the other side of an important division, but you are like I am, you are a fully human person, you have that intrinsic dignity. It is also a tool of conflict to deny the equal humanity of others, to say they are not fully human, they are an X or a Y, and therefore the most atrocious things can be done to them because those restraints are not there. So when you come from conflict, if you've got people who are in an ill-educated or uneducated state which are being preyed on to dehumanise others who have been part of the conflict, you've got almost no chance of creating a democracy. You might impose various institutions and you might secure an absence of conflict, but I don't think you'll build what democracies ultimately demand. It's only when you can have people open to the possibility of seeing in the other in a post-conflict environment that they are as much a person as they are, that they have shared interests and things of that kind, that I think you can begin to get there. And that's partly about awareness. As I say, it's very much about education. It's also about leadership. But it is more, to go to what Leanne was saying, it is more than just words and sentiment. It then needs to be put into the bones, if you like, the systems, policies and structures. It needs to be given a form so it can't be blown away as some intangible or insubstantial stuff.
Leanne, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that for people here and joining online, about that the heavy work of institutional building and good governance, because they're lovely words for us to say, but there's behind that so much effort and energy. What does that look like, or what is the effort to drive that?
So I had some experience in Afghanistan working inside the foreign ministry, because I came from a foreign ministry. I had some diplomatic skills, and so I worked in the Afghan foreign ministry, helping them restart their international treaty reporting obligations. Ironically, we started with the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And what I learned from that experience is as foreigners, when you walk into these situations, you're entering a governance structure that already exists for whatever state it's in, and you're working with colleagues who have been doing their jobs for a really long time for very little money, and you walk in as a foreigner working for the UN or another development organisation, and you're young and you're getting paid really well and you think you know what you're doing, and you know so little, and you need to really respect the people who have been there doing this for a long time and learn what you need to understand and then figure out what you can do to contribute. But building that trust and getting into those relationships, again, this is not something you tick off in 6 months or 12 months' time. And so I think the international community needs to think about investing and whether there's a genuine commitment to investment in a nation state and how long that commitment is for, and then build programs back from the realism of that, because otherwise you end up with donors and Security Council members who will complain that we've thrown so much money at the Democratic Republic of Congo and it's still a disaster. Well, we need to be more realistic and practical and honest about what our commitment to nation state building is in that particular case.
Can I add something to what Suspense said? Yeah. So it's prompted a thought back to when I was invited to Vietnam when they were first opening their economy under a policy called Doi Moi. And they had seen from afar a thing called the market. And it looked like it was a pretty good thing. It looks like a fruit tree, if you like, which is beautiful and it's laden with beautiful juicy fruit. And if you just get one of these, then you'll get the fruit as well. So they import this into their nation, as so many others have done. They plant it. And instead of getting this beautiful tree with all of its fruit, what they get is a slightly twisted and gnarled thing. Why? Because no effort was made to transfer the tree and graft it onto indigenous rootstock, local customs, traditions, ways of doing things. And ever since I saw that happen, I've thought that one of the problems when people from outside come with good intentions to bring democracy or the market or whatever it happens to be, is that they don't spend nearly enough time to understand what are the analogues that produce the beautiful fruit. You know, what's the rootstock that's laden within Vietnamese culture or Afghan culture, that if only you understood it and valued it and used it, it could provide all the nutrients and other things that you need. Instead, you just go plonk, here it is. And that's how, and I think there's a general lesson in that around how we, from well-intentioned nations seeking to assist, make some terribly bad mistakes by not attending to the ground on which we hope to build.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for that reflection.
That goes back to the democratic participatory method, of listening. We made the joke that to really assist, we have to shut up and listen. It can be rude, but who are we to bring with some... Sorry?
No, Leanne wanted to.
You just made me think of something. Please.
There is. We shared this in class. The importance of participatory democracy, that we have to. It must be from bottom up. Otherwise, it's pointless. The democracy is for whom? For the people. By whom? By the people. It cannot be imposed. If it's imposed, it's doomed for fail.
I think that's absolutely right, Izabela. And I think one step further, and I'm sorry if I sound negative about this, but I think the worst thing the international community can do is not only come in and say here, I literally heard a UN official in Afghanistan at the end of the first parliamentary election say, we have installed democracy.
Tick.
And I thought, wow, worse than that even is when, and I think this is part of why we're seeing democracy lose respect as an institution around the world. Worse is when countries like the United States, to be honest, push a model of democracy and then undermine it in the places they're going. Now, I saw that in lots of different places, but in Afghanistan also, we ran a transitional justice process. It went for a year. We went down to the village level, the provincial level, the state level, and we listened and we listened and we listened. And we wrote up a report and it got filed on a shelf. And all those brave people who stood up and spoke out and looked their aggressor in the face and said and told the truth, we completely let them down and pulled the carpet out from underneath them. In other cases, when we support first elections in countries and we set up the infrastructure of democracy, electoral complaints commissions, for example. If a political candidate's being harassed, you can make a complaint and justice will be served. When we set up those structures, but because we're so focused on peace and stability, that we see the rumblings of any tensions, that democracy creates space for conflict in a sense, right?
Yes.
We see rumblings of tensions, and so we shut down the very systems we created to allow people to engage and respond. Then we undermine the whole concept of democracy.
Of course, my experience is on East Timor, but as I'm listening to you, I can totally remember all the experience that I've gone through as a democratic governance officer on this. What is institution building? Like, it's so blurred. What is institution build? Sitting down and, okay, what would be what the Supreme Court will look like? How many judges to design all this and to listening and then undermining to put it on a shelf. It's, at the end, it's all paper. But the energy, the amount of meetings, at the end must be for the people.
Absolutely.
But in case if moving from a negative experience to positive one, I have to say that East Timor is a case of success. In terms of the levels of democracy or in the prosperity of its economy, it is the largest in Southeast Asia. So it's something that we should take into account, the learning lesson. Mm-hmm. And perhaps the learning lesson was precisely to listen to them, because Sir Vieira de Mello, who died in Iraq, was the first president during the transition time. He made sure that he was not the one taking decision. It was a college, a committee of Timorese leaders that would run and say what they want. You want that? Okay, fine. What next you want? To run as more democratic as possible.
A good point about leadership and organisational culture as well. I know there's so much knowledge and talent around our room here and our virtual room. So I wanted to have an opportunity for people to ask questions of our I can see the hands already going up. So please put your hand up. If you could just introduce yourself, just to say your name, or if you felt okay. Thank you, Emma.
Leanne, Mia is the next generation leader of human rights advocate.
Thank you, Mia. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, so I'm Mia Louise, or just Mia. I just have two questions. The first is, especially in a Eurocentric kind of country such as the United States or like Australia, would you say democracy is kind of starting to fail here, because when you're voting for a political party, it's not more voting for the one you want to vote, but voting for the least worst party?
Okay, maybe we might take another question. Did you have two questions?
Yes.
Or? Okay.
And my next one was when going to, say, another country and to how you have to understand and learn more, how would you go say about doing that? Would you do the research, say, beforehand or when you get there?
Okay. And we might take one more. If there's one more question in the room, or did you? Yep. We're just so if we take a bunch of questions. Is that okay?
Hello, my name is Matthew. I'm a fifth-year student here at Western Sydney University. My question is in reference to the coups that you previously mentioned in Africa. There's a new term that's been coming up lately. It's called the coup belt, specifically the one in the Sahara Desert. The reason why I'm asking this is because the majority of those coups were against other governments which had secured power for a coup. I mean, a great example was in Mali, when I think there were 3 coups in the year 2020 or 2021. I was just wondering, is this more about the cultural norms of having a coup in the Northern Africa, or is it about preventing democracy from actually spreading?
Okay.
Who answers?
Do you want to start, Izabela, with the question about a coup belt? I've not heard this sort of domino theory.
First, terminologies.
We have one more.
Oh, okay. And Mia, Louise, remind me of your first question.
Yes.
Okay.
Just a comment on the justice, which was I think, Leanne, you mentioned, which might be a missing link to fulfill democracy. And I was just thinking, where would it lie if states are not respected when following the culture of their land? And then I looked at even development itself has been solely defined by the UN. and not leaving the state to define their own development. So does democracy, which steps on state culture, how is that defining for the people? Which people?
Thank you, Mariam. So do you want to start with that question about the coup, catching coups?
First terminology. We love to create new terminologies, yeah? Peace belt, so many terminologies, pure academic, or maybe can be a journalistic way of catching audience. Beyond terminologies, I would say that to explain the amount of coup happening all the time in that region goes back to the idea of governance. It's not about the fighting for the idea of democracy, because you see, you have military coup taking power from democratic elected, but democratic elected that been there the 40 years, the son, the father, is a whole oligopoly system. So we see people celebrating the military coup. That's what's weird for us coming from this side of the world. Why are they celebrating? They all enjoy on the street. They all, what was the expression, that jubilancy, is that an expression?
Jubilant.
Jubilancy, sorry for the pronunciation, but it's beyond happiness. Why? Because they are looking at the hope of having a better life, not better life in terms of freedom, but in fighting poverty, inequality, is the what we call democracy in the pocket. If I can pay my rent and send my kids to school, then I'll be perhaps on the street celebrating, showing that democracy perhaps is not providing the governance that it needs. So it's not because of culture.
There are a number of different strands that fit together, starting with your last question. It's true that, and it's about legitimacy. There are many countries where legitimacy is not because one is elected, but one inherits a title. So you might have been born the son of a chief who is the son of or it might be a matrilineal system where property is vested in women that goes to women and so forth. And in those situations, legitimacy is established in very deep cultural roots, which don't necessarily accord with getting it through the vote. And if that legitimacy is also paired, as it used to be in many traditional monarchical systems, with an obligation to look to the welfare of your subjects and to advance their interests, then people will be relatively happy because they'll say, you will look after me, you will make sure I do have food in my pocket, education for my child and things like that. The trouble is that those systems often can be corrupted, and one of the promises of democracy is that because as a citizen you can cast your vote, you will be noticed by the powerful who solicit that, and that they will deliver you the benefits you aspire to in order to be able to secure power. And of course, this comes to the first question you asked about, well, what do you do when you turn up to vote? There's no one that you really want to vote for, and you're rendered to have the least bad alternative. And in those circumstances, the legitimacy of the system starts to break down, because if you're in a democracy and you think actually the party will only look after its own, or it will only look after people in marginal electorates, not care about the others, or it'll only look after those who are the big political donors, then the promise that it's giving around legitimacy and return is undermined. So you've got to be very careful when playing with concepts of democracy as to what system and what context you're operating in. But that's its great strength too. There is no one form that is democratic. It's not as if it has to be two houses of parliament and this and that.
Different models.
The point is, citizens in a democracy can choose any form that meets their requirements, and that's the legitimacy it will have. If you can get those elements correct, then it starts to be constructive, and it can accommodate other traditional forms which might pre-exist.
Thank you. I might get Leanne to also speak about that practical, for aspiring humanitarians, the practical point about how do you learn about a new place, a new sort of context? What are the processes that you go through?
I might link that question with, is it Mariam? because I think they go together well. Obviously, before you land anywhere, you should try and know as much about the place as you can, the language, the culture, the religion, the different ethnic groups. But when you land, I think, and this can be hard in contexts that are crisis situations because there are security risks. And if you're working for an international organisation, they have responsibility to take care of you. So what I was going to say is get into the local culture as soon and as quickly as you can. Work with local organisations, take their lead in how to approach a policy issue or the right place to go, the right village to go and visit. Follow the lead of the people with the expertise. Security, as I said, can make that a challenge in post-conflict scenarios because you can't get as close to local culture as would be helpful. Going to Mariam's question about around intervention and local culture, we've learned a lot in the peacekeeping and peacebuilding space since peacekeeping started, really, about mistakes that have been made and ways to do things better. And there's no shortage of navel gazing, report writing, Security Council resolutions that talk about those lessons and how we should do better. So one of the key principles that's been identified in the peacebuilding literature is around local ownership, national ownership. So in my experience, every intervention I've been involved with has, at least on paper and through process, started with consultation. But the problem with that is also when a country's coming out of conflict, there are power dynamics and there are winners and there are losers and there are people who can speak English and there are people who wear a Western suit and there are people who don't. And so the voices around the table and making sure you've got a representative set of voices around the table is crucial. Even when you make your best efforts to get that right, there are always going to be winners and losers. So taking a local lead is the starting point. But I have to say, my experience in Afghanistan was that I came into the country at first parliamentary elections, so much excitement, so much energy, so much international attention. And I left 2 years later because I could feel in my bones that we had lost the support of the Afghans. I literally had a colleague at the Afghan Foreign Ministry say to me, you know what, we can stuff this up on our own as well as you're stuffing it up. And I thought,
goosebumps.
This is not working. And the point that was made about when you go into someone else's country, you've got to start where they are. You've got to start with what they want. And that might not be a classic model of democracy. I'm a human rights lawyer. When you go in and talk about human rights, don't start with sexual identity. Maybe start with the right to shelter or health or education. Maybe start with rights language that is about rights that actually desperately matter to mothers and families. And you can start where people are, and maybe that's how you build the confidence to keep going.
We've got a powerhouse of people also online who've got some questions, but I've made a commitment to try to finish at 2:30 because Leanne's jetting off to the heart of democracy this afternoon. But maybe, I don't know if I can borrow 5 more minutes, or do you need to go, because it's 2:30?
I'll go within the next 5 minutes.
Okay, is that okay? Yeah, so if you please, when you need to. But I do want to take some of the questions from the online. We've got 20 people online, including John Langmore, who I'm seeing you there, John. Hello. Did you want to read the questions, a few questions that we could cover in the next 4 minutes?
Thanks, Leanne. I've got one question online from Lauren. How do you measure when a country is in an ongoing stable state of peace? Has it achieved, for lack of a better word, the 12 dividends of peace?
Okay, measuring peace. Just a small question. How do you measure the dividends of peace? What are the KPIs, or how do you know?
Are people satisfied? How free and fair are the elections? This is subjective, but there are some elements there. Violence? That is opposite. So the minimum violence during the election and after the election can be also an indicator. Here I'm referring, for example, Kenya, 2007, 1,300 people dead because of election, 600,000 displaced because of election. So election can be a tool for violence and therefore can be precisely the opposite of building a democracy and peace and all together. Economy could be another measure, but it's not the only one, because you can have a prosperity like China and be non-democratic.
I might say that people could also pick up your book and have a read of it to see a little bit more about a detailed exploration of democracy as well, because of course this is a very big question.
But legitimacy is, I think, key.
Yeah. I'm unfortunately, as a moderator, the worst part is having to curtail all this fantastic conversation and discussion because we've committed to finish at 2:30. I wanted to firstly join me in thanking our speakers, Leanne Smith, Izabela, and also, and Professor Pollock for also joining us here today as the Acting Vice-Chancellor. Thank you so much.